Hey guys, tonight we're not going far into myth or imagination. We're going into something that actually happened. Something that, if you woke up in the wrong year, would have looked like the end of the world. So, settle in. Maybe dim the lights. This story begins quietly, with the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. It's 1816. The world doesn't know it yet, but the sun has disappeared. Well, not completely. It's still up there, hidden behind layers of ash and ice and disbelief. But to the people living through that year, it feels like it's gone. The mornings are gray. The afternoons are cold. The evenings fall into darkness far too soon. And no one, not the scientists, not the farmers, not the priests, can explain why. This is remembered as the year without a summer. But at the time, there was no name for it. There was just hunger, confusion, and fear. Imagine waking up in the middle of June, expecting warmth, sunlight, crops growing tall, and instead seeing frost covering your fields, ice forming on your window, your breath fogging in the air, birds silent, cattle refusing to graze. In England, the farmers tried to plant anyway. They tilled the soil, prayed over the seeds, and waited. Nothing grew. The rain didn't stop for weeks. When it did, the temperature dropped overnight. Wheat rotted in the fields. Cows starved. Horses died standing up. Across Europe, the story was the same. France, still recovering from Napoleon's defeat, suddenly found itself trapped in a cold gray nightmare. Grain prices doubled, then tripled. Bakers were mobbed in the streets. In Ireland, potato crops failed. People dug through dirt for whatever they could find, roots, grass, bark. And far to the east, in China, rivers froze out of season. Monsoons collapsed. Floods destroyed rice fields, and famine followed in their wake. No one understood what was happening. There were no weather satellites, no global communication, no volcano reports from half a world away. To most people, it felt biblical, punishment, or prophecy, depending on who you asked. The most terrifying part was that the sun itself seemed to change. Its light turned pale, washed out, almost metallic. People stared at it in disbelief, whispering that God had dimmed the world. The sky at noon looked like dusk. At sunset, it burned red and purple, beautiful but wrong. Painters captured it in their work. Skies that looked bruised, landscapes smothered in haze. And all the while, the temperature stayed low. June felt like November. Lakes froze. Birds migrated in the wrong direction. In North America, it wasn't much better. In New England, snow fell in June, thick, heavy snow that blanketed the cornfields. Farmers wrote about their crops freezing overnight, entire herds dying from sudden frost. Ice formed on ponds in July. The 4th of July fireworks were canceled because of sleet. People didn't just lose their food. They lost their sense of reason. Without sunlight, time itself felt strange. The rhythm of days and seasons broke. People grew anxious, then desperate, then something darker. Rumors began to spread about curses, comets, and the end of the world. Religious revivals swept through towns. Preachers shouted that the Lord was punishing humanity for its arrogance. Villagers held all-night vigils, waiting for salvation that never came. In Germany, some communities built end-of-the-world processions, people walking barefoot through freezing mud, chanting prayers. Others turned on each other. Bread riots broke out in Britain and France. Millers and bakers were accused of hoarding grain. Governments sent soldiers to guard warehouses full of rotting food. And while the common people starved, the aristocrats wrote about it in their journals like it was weather gossip. "The sun is strangely weak today," one English noblewoman noted. "And the air carries a smell of smoke. I feel uneasy." She wasn't wrong about the smoke. But it wasn't coming from any earthly fire they could see. Because halfway across the world, in Indonesia, something enormous had happened. something that had already changed the sky itself. A year earlier, in 1815, a mountain called Tambora had exploded. It was the largest volcanic eruption in recorded history, 10 times stronger than Krakatoa, 100 times louder than anything human ears could bear. The explosion threw billions of tons of ash and sulfur into the upper atmosphere. The sound alone traveled 1,200 miles. Entire islands were buried. Tens of thousands died instantly. But that was just the beginning. The fine volcanic ash didn't fall back to Earth. It drifted upward, carried by winds into the stratosphere, forming a thin, invisible veil around the planet. It reflected sunlight back into space, cooling the Earth by nearly a full degree, enough to tip the balance between warmth and winter. No one in 1816 knew this. They only saw the symptoms: frost in summer, famine in autumn, despair in winter. In Switzerland, along the shores of Lake Geneva, the storms rolled in without mercy. The mountains vanished behind walls of fog. Lightning danced on the water for hours. And inside one of the villas overlooking that dark lake, a small group of travelers, poets, dreamers, and one young woman, gathered to wait out the rain. Her name was Mary Shelley. She was 18. She was cold. And before the year ended, she would write Frankenstein. But that part of the story will come later. For now, the world outside that villa was falling apart in slow motion. Crops failed. Livestock died. Hunger became the great equalizer. In New England, families burned their furniture for warmth. In Europe, desperate farmers slaughtered their work animals, knowing that without them, next year's harvest would never come. People began eating whatever they could: sawdust bread, boiled nettles, ground bones, anything to fill the hollow ache. And in that long, gray silence, something inside humanity began to break. Not just bodies, but minds. This wasn't a disaster that came and went. It was a disaster that lingered, one that stretched across months, until hope thinned out like the light itself. No one knew how long it would last. No one knew if the sun would ever come back. And when people lose sunlight, they lose more than warmth. They lose direction. They lose memory. They lose themselves. This was the summer that never came. The year the world forgot how to wake up. And the year the sun disappeared, not from the sky, but from the hearts of the people who waited for it. The strange thing about catastrophe is how slowly it begins. It doesn't arrive with trumpets or thunder. It creeps in quietly, day by day, until one morning you realize that everything familiar has changed. In 1816, that realization settled over Europe like a second winter. By May, the air had already turned wrong, sharp, thin, and dry. Farmers noticed it first. Seeds refused to sprout. The soil stayed hard, even under rain. Birds migrated in strange patterns. And the light, it was always the light, felt dim and metallic as if filtered through smoke. Across France and Switzerland, people waited for spring to start. Didn't. The snow that melted one week fell again the next. The wind carried ash across mountains no one knew existed. The clouds never seemed to clear. When the first planting season failed, farmers tried again. And again. Each time, frost came early. Each time, rain came late. In villages that had survived wars and revolutions, famine now crept through the streets in silence. The newspapers, what few existed, called it a year of inconvenience. They didn't yet have the words for what was coming. In Germany, a man named Johann Müller kept a diary. He wrote about how the sky looked bruised, a wound that won't close. He wrote about his cattle dying, his wife coughing blood, and the bread shrinking in size every week. "The wheat has forgotten us," he wrote. "The earth has closed her hands." And still nobody understood why. Some believed the sun had caught a fever. Others thought it was punishment For the wars, the pride, the blood spilled during Napoleon's campaigns. Priests began holding public exorcisms, waving incense at the sky. In the Swiss Alps, processions wound up mountainsides, begging the Virgin Mary to turn the weather. In Ireland, people prayed for sunlight like it was a miracle. It never came. By July, the frost began again. Not the gentle shimmer of early morning, but a killing frost that turned crops to glass. Entire fields cracked under the weight of it. Livestock froze where they stood, their bodies stiff and rimed with ice. Travelers wrote of walking past dead birds on the roads, hundreds of them, scattered like fallen leaves. And then came the rain, endless, filthy rain. It fell for weeks, flooding rivers, drowning whatever had survived the frost. Mudslides buried entire villages. Roads vanished. The countryside turned into a sea of gray water and dead grass. Famine doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, the quiet despair of hunger turned into something stranger, a collective madness that spread faster than any disease. In the Swiss countryside, travelers wrote of villages holding nightly vigils, convinced the world was ending. Entire congregations stayed awake until dawn, faces pale in candlelight, waiting for angels that never arrived. In Bavaria, a preacher declared that the sun's dimming meant Judgment Day. He gathered hundreds of followers who sold their possessions and stood on hillsides, waiting for the sky to open. When it didn't, they wept and started again. Science offered no comfort. The few meteorologists of the age had no instruments to measure what was happening. They guessed it was a solar sickness, a flaw in the heavens themselves. The idea that a volcano halfway around the world could cause global winter wouldn't be understood for decades. Meanwhile, in England, the summer that wasn't drove even the wealthy into despair. Gardens died. Croquet lawns froze solid. Aristocrats wrote letters about the melancholy fog that clung to the landscape. Poets wrote about death, and death wrote back. Lord Byron, trapped by storms in Geneva, looked out over Lake Leman and wrote a poem called Darkness. It begins like this: I had a dream which was not all a dream. The bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space. He wasn't exaggerating. The skies were so dim that midday looked like twilight. The stars flickered even at noon. People covered mirrors, terrified by the dullness of their own reflections. In Italy, disease followed hunger. Malaria spread through stagnant floodwaters. In Ireland, typhus returned. The doctors had no idea what to do. Their medicines were powerless, their patients too weak to recover. Town after town emptied into graveyards. And across the Atlantic, America was suffering too. New England saw snow in June and frost in August. The corn died before harvest. Farmers slaughtered their animals rather than watch them starve. Smoke from burning fields hung low over the valleys. Families packed wagons and left for the frontier, searching for warmth that didn't exist. They called it the year 1800 and starved to death. Horses became too expensive to feed, so people ate them. Those who couldn't afford that walked westward, toward Ohio, toward Kentucky, toward hope. The American frontier swelled with desperate migrants. Entire towns disappeared, their houses abandoned, their names forgotten. The newspapers wrote about a temporary inconvenience, but everyone knew better. The seasons had broken, and with them, something in the human spirit cracked too. People stopped planning. They stopped marrying. They stopped singing. And in the quiet of that endless gray sky, something strange began to happen. A sort of dull awakening. Artists painted the darkness. Writers described it. Philosophers pondered it. It was as though, with the world stripped of color, humanity began to see itself more clearly. That was the year Mary Shelley sat beside the same lake Byron had stared across, listening to thunder roll through the mountains. She was 18. She couldn't sleep. The rain hadn't stopped in weeks. And while her companions told ghost stories by candlelight, she began to imagine one of her own. About a scientist who tried to bring the dead to life, and what happened when he succeeded. That night, she dreamed of a man kneeling beside his creation, horrified by what he had made. She woke shaking, and outside, lightning still flickered over the black water. It was July, the middle of summer, but outside her window it was snowing. The first thing hunger takes from you is not your body. It's your sense of time. Days blur into each other. Mornings and nights lose meaning when the sky never changes. The light, if you can call it that, comes in shades of ash, soft gray, bruised blue, dull copper at sunset. People wake because their stomachs ache, not because the world has turned. By the summer of 1816, hunger had stopped being a problem and become a presence. It lingered everywhere, in doorways, in streets, in the silence after church bells. It crept into every home, every prayer, every dream. In Germany, the famine was so severe that even the wealthy rationed bread. Bakers' windows stood empty. Children chased soldiers' horses for dropped grain. In Switzerland, villagers traded jewelry for potatoes that never ripened. People began grinding pine bark and moss into flour, baking it into loaves that crumbled into dust. They called it hunger bread. It filled the mouth but not the stomach. The famine spread like frost over glass, slowly, invisibly, until the whole continent was veiled in despair. In England, the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge wrote about the absence of heat and light as though creation had been forgotten. He was right. It felt like the world had been put aside. Governments did what governments always do in a crisis. They talked, they blamed, they passed decrees. In France, officials sent soldiers to escort grain shipments under guard. In Austria, pamphlets warned that hoarding food was a sin. But the soldiers were starving too, and pamphlets don't feed anyone. The price of oats, once a poor man's grain, soared until even horses went hungry. People joked bitterly that only the rich could afford to ride anymore. By winter, there were no jokes left. And yet, somehow, life went on. In every famine, there are moments that feel impossible. Weddings, births, songs whispered through empty streets. People found ways to pretend it was temporary. In one Swiss village, they still held their annual festival. There were no cakes, no flowers, no music, just a circle of villagers standing around an unlit bonfire, waiting for a spark that never came. When the rain started again, they laughed, softly, almost kindly, and went home. That kind of laughter is its own form of rebellion. Across the Atlantic, the same despair was turning into motion. In the northeastern United States, farmers packed up their lives and moved west. They called it the Great Migration. The land had failed them. Perhaps the next valley would not. Families sold their houses for wagons, tied what was left of their livestock to the back, and began walking. You can still find their letters, small, careful handwriting, stained with soot and rain. One woman wrote, "We walk west, though there is no warmth there yet. The children ask where summer went. I tell them it's waiting for us." In places like Vermont and New Hampshire, entire towns emptied. Those who stayed watched the smoke of departing caravans disappear over the hills. They called the migrants sun chasers. It was meant as an insult, but there was tenderness in it too. Everyone wanted to chase the sun. Back in Europe, science was beginning to catch up to superstition. Slowly, cautiously. A few scholars in London and Paris began to suspect that the problem wasn't divine punishment but atmospheric interference. But what kind of interference could swallow the entire world? That question hung unanswered for decades. For ordinary people, explanations didn't matter anymore. They just needed to survive the next day. And so they adapted. In Ireland, Families dried seaweed and ground it into flour. In Italy, they hunted pigeons. In Switzerland, they boiled straw into soup. The taste didn't matter, only the act of chewing, the illusion of nourishment. The human mind has a strange resilience, can turn starvation into ritual. People prayed before meals that didn't exist, sat at empty tables out of habit, offered thanks to a god who stayed hidden behind clouds. But there were also moments of light, thin, trembling, but real. In a small village near Zurich, a teacher began keeping a journal for his students. He wrote lessons on survival and kindness, drawing sketches of edible plants and wild herbs. "The sun," he wrote, "is asleep, but it dreams of us." In France, a young chemist named Nicolas Appert, working alone in his kitchen, was experimenting with ways to preserve food for longer. He sealed soup and vegetables in glass bottles, boiled them, and waited. When he opened them weeks later, the food was still good. He didn't know it yet, but he had invented canning, the first small victory against famine. Even in the bleakest year, invention thrives. And far away, on the shores of Lake Geneva, that same storm that trapped Lord Byron and Mary Shelley indoors was quietly changing the course of literature. The story goes like this. It was too cold to go outside. The rain hammered against the windows. The group, Byron, Percy Shelley, Mary, and a young doctor named John Polidori, sat by the fire, restless and bored. Someone suggested they each write a ghost story. What followed became the foundation of modern horror. Mary Shelley began Frankenstein, a tale born from lightning and loneliness. Polidori wrote The Vampire, the ancestor of every vampire story that came after. And Byron, brooding as always, wrote his poem Darkness. They didn't know it, but their stories were not fiction, they were reflections. The monsters they created were metaphors for the world outside their window. Cold, strange, and barely alive. There's something poetic about that. When nature turned against humanity, humanity responded with imagination. When the world grew dark, people began to dream. By the end of that cursed summer, the weather had become unpredictable in a new way. Some days, the sky cleared and people cheered, only for hail to fall by evening. In Scotland, a traveler wrote, "It is as if the earth itself cannot decide whether to live or die." And yet, there were still those who hoped. Farmers planted late crops, gambling on an early autumn that never arrived. Parents told their children that next year would be better. Merchants stocked their shelves again. People prayed with the weary optimism of those who have no other choice. When you read their letters, you realized they weren't just fighting hunger. They were fighting despair, the cold inside the mind that says the light won't return. But it did. Slowly, uncertainly, it did. By December, faint hints of recovery appeared. The snow still fell, but the frost seemed softer. The skies showed streaks of gold instead of gray. No one dared to call it hope. Not yet, but the air felt different. Less heavy, less haunted. The world was beginning to thaw. And while no one knew it then, the price of that thaw had already been written into history. Millions dead, thousands displaced, and one generation forever changed. They had lived through a year without summer, a year when the sun disappeared, and though the light would return, something in them, some trust in the natural order, never would. It would take years before the mystery was solved, and decades before the name Tambora entered textbooks. But by then, the survivors had already learned their lesson. The sky could betray you, the sun could vanish, and the world you thought you knew could simply stop. It's strange how the human mind reacts to darkness. Some people pray, some panic, and some begin to invent monsters. The year 1816 wasn't just cold. It was creatively radioactive. The absence of sunlight didn't just chill the air. It rewired imaginations. Something about the long gray days and endless storms seemed to open a door inside people. And what came through that door was both beautiful and terrifying. Byron and the Shelleys, trapped by weather in the damp villa on Lake Geneva, were bored in the way only brilliant, slightly unhinged young people can be. The rain didn't stop. The candles burned low. The thunder rolled over the mountains like an argument that wouldn't end. And so, to pass the time, they started telling ghost stories. It sounds like a cliché now, a group of poets by candlelight, but that's exactly what happened. Byron, always dramatic, suggested that each of them write a story to raise the hairs on the head. Polidori, the young doctor who'd followed Byron across Europe in a haze of admiration, scribbled notes furiously. Percy Shelley stared into the fire, muttering about science. And Mary, quiet, thoughtful Mary, listened. She was 18, newly married, grieving a lost child, and surrounded by men who thought her fragile. But she wasn't. She had the kind of patience that waits for the right storm. And that storm had finally arrived. That night, she dreamed of a man, a brilliant, lonely man, kneeling beside a creature he had brought to life. The creature opened its eyes. The man screamed. When she woke, the dream clung to her like cold water. Within weeks, she began to write it down. The title she eventually chose was Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus. It's easy to forget how radical that story was. In a world where most people still believed the weather came from heaven, Mary Shelley imagined a world where humans stole the power of creation itself. Her monster wasn't just a corpse stitched together from parts. It was science, ambition, and grief, all the things humanity was too afraid to admit it wanted. She wrote about a scientist who thought he could control nature, only to discover that nature had plans of its own. Sound familiar? It's hard not to see Frankenstein as a perfect child of the year without a summer. The same arrogance that drove Victor Frankenstein to defy death had driven humanity to reshape the earth, cutting forests, burning coal, believing itself untouchable. And when the world struck back, when the sky darkened and the crops died, people did what they always do when they're frightened. They made art. The weather outside that villa was chaos. Lightning flashed constantly. Thunder shook the windows. Byron compared it to the world convulsing in labor pains. Every strike of lightning seemed to echo the monster's creation scene, electricity as both birth and punishment. And so, while Europe starved and America froze, Mary Shelley created life out of despair. Polidori, not to be outdone, wrote The Vampire, a short story about an elegant nobleman who feeds on the lifeblood of others. It was the first modern vampire story, and it turned Byron's own reputation into legend. In one stormy night, two monsters were born, Frankenstein's creature and the vampire. Both were reflections of a world that felt drained of light, obsessed with death, and haunted by the fear that humanity had gone too far. It's almost poetic, really. The darker the world became, the brighter the imagination burned. Outside their villa, the lake swelled against its banks. Switzerland was starving. Travelers told stories of entire villages swept away by floods. But inside, around that candlelit table, something extraordinary was happening. The human mind was refusing extinction. That's what art does, it builds fires in the dark. By the time the group left Geneva, their lives had changed forever. Byron's reputation as a dark romantic was sealed. Percy Shelley wrote his poem Mont Blanc, where he stared into the glacier and felt it stare back. And Mary, still quiet, still young, carried with her a manuscript that would outlive them all. Back in England, Frankenstein was published anonymously in 1818. Reviewers didn't know what to make of it. Some called it blasphemy, others genius. The word scientist didn't even exist yet, but the warning did. If you try to play God, you might end up hating what you create. History would take a while to understand what she'd done. But the connection between that book and that year is too perfect to ignore. The The same volcano that dimmed the sun also ignited an idea that nature is vast, indifferent, and dangerous when provoked. Frankenstein wasn't born from horror fiction, it was born from the weather. Meanwhile, in the rest of Europe, the madness of 1816 was taking cultural shape too. Painters like J. M. W. Turner began to fill their canvases with skies that glowed red and gold from the volcanic haze. The sunsets that terrified farmers inspired art that would later define an era. Even the great composers, Beethoven, Schubert, wrote music that felt heavy with atmosphere, the sound of weather turning emotional. And all of it came from the same source, a mountain halfway around the world that no one in Europe had ever heard of. Mount Tambora had erupted with a violence that defied imagination. Whole villages had vanished. The noise had traveled across oceans. But its true impact wasn't the explosion, it was the silence it left behind. That silence spread across the world, and people filled it with stories. Some of those stories were terrifying, others tragic, a few even hopeful. But together, they revealed a strange truth. When nature strips away certainty, imagination rushes to replace it. In that sense, the year without a summer didn't just give us hunger and fear. It gave us Frankenstein, the vampire, the romantic movement, and a deeper understanding of our own fragility. You could even say it created the modern world's love affair with apocalypse. The idea that the end might not come as fire and brimstone, but as quiet, unrelenting dimness. The slow fading of light until we start to see what's really hiding in the dark. And maybe that's why stories like Shelley's still work. Because they remind us that we're always one mistake, one eruption, one dimming of the sun away from realizing how thin the boundary really is between progress and punishment. By the time the skies cleared, Europe had changed forever. A generation had grown up under shadows. They'd seen the limits of reason, the cruelty of nature, and the strange beauty of survival. And just like that, the monster walked out of the pages and into history, carrying with it the memory of that cold, gray year when humanity went a little mad. The world had survived, but it had learned something uncomfortable. Sometimes, when the light disappears, it doesn't come back the same. Before the cold came, before the hunger, before poets turned nightmares into literature, there was a sound. It began in April of 1815, somewhere in the Indonesian archipelago, on an island few Europeans could have pointed to on a map. Mount Tambora had been sleeping for centuries. When it woke, it didn't stir gently. It tore the sky open. The explosion was so loud that people thought the world had ended. It was heard more than 1,200 miles away, so far that sailors near Sumatra thought a cannon war had started. Villages hundreds of kilometers distant felt the ground shudder and saw the air turn white with falling ash. For days, the island shivered under a rain of fire. Modern scientists estimate that the eruption released more energy than all the atomic bombs ever detonated combined. Imagine a mountain taller than the clouds collapsing into itself. The top simply vanished, replaced by a crater 4 miles wide. 10,000 feet of stone and soil shot upward, then began to fall back as black glass, pumice, and ash. Everything living within miles of Tambora, villages, forests, birds, was erased. Entire languages disappeared overnight. There were communities on that island whose names are now forgotten because no one survived to remember them. Ships passing through the Java Sea encountered floating islands of ash so thick they had to stop their engines. The sky rained stones. Rivers boiled. And then came the part no one saw because it happened far above the clouds. A column of smoke rose more than 40 kilometers into the atmosphere, piercing the stratosphere. There, fine particles of sulfur dioxide mixed with water vapor to form a veil, an invisible, reflective blanket that spread across the globe. Each molecule scattered sunlight back into space. To people living below, the effect was subtle at first. A redder sunset, a chill at night, then month by month it grew. The veil thickened. The light dimmed. By late 1815, sailors in the Indian Ocean noticed something uncanny. The sky never cleared completely. Even on bright days, the horizon was smudged, as if drawn in pencil. A British captain wrote that the heavens appear painted with smoke. He didn't know it yet, but he was watching the birth of the next year's disaster. Tambara's eruption poured nearly 100 cubic kilometers of material into the air. To put it simply, it gave the planet a new atmosphere. And it was global. The monsoon season in Asia failed. Crops that depended on predictable rain withered. In India, drought followed by cholera would kill millions. In China, snow fell on summer rice fields. Entire provinces went hungry. Meanwhile, half a world away, the effects were creeping westward. Over Africa, over the Middle East, into Europe's fragile climate system. The Earth's average temperature dropped by about 1 degree Celsius. A small number on paper, catastrophic in reality. We don't think of 1 degree as much, but 1 degree is the difference between ice and water, between harvest and famine. In 1816, that difference became the hinge of history. The strange weather that settled over Europe was not simply cold. It was chaotic. The wind shifted unpredictably. Clouds moved like smoke. There were storms that never ended, hail that fell in midsummer, and mornings where frost formed on flower petals that should have been blooming. No one knew the cause. There was no telegraph, no network of scientists sharing notes across continents. In the newspapers, some blamed a solar eclipse of unknown origin. Others said the sunspots seen through telescopes were wounds in the sun itself. The church called for repentance, and somewhere, beneath that gray ceiling, life went on as if by habit. But in Indonesia, the land that had birthed the chaos, the story was still unfolding. The island of Sumbawa, where Tambora stood, had become unrecognizable. What had been lush and green was now a desert of ash. Survivors, few as they were, described wandering through daylight so dim it looked like twilight. They drank water from puddles of melted ash. They ate whatever roots they could dig up. Ships that passed the coast in the months after the eruption described the air as a sea of soot. Even a year later, the smell of sulfur still clung to the waves. It's hard to imagine now how one mountain's breath could change the color of the entire planet. But that's exactly what happened. The sunsets of 1816 were described in letters and journals as blood orange, copper, and unnatural crimson. Artists painted them, not realizing they were recording volcanic dust. In England, Turner's landscapes glowed with impossible light. In Germany, Caspar David Friedrich painted skies that looked haunted, ashen gold fading into shadow. Even the way people saw beauty changed. Before Tambora, sunsets had been serene. Afterward, they were apocalyptic. For the first time, humanity began to sense that the earth itself was not passive, that it could act, and when it did, the consequences were beyond human scale. In Europe, the rumors multiplied. Some said the world was tilting on its axis. Others blamed comets or industrial smoke. In America, ministers preached that God was dimming the sun to warn of moral decay. Everyone was wrong, but everyone felt the same thing. Fear wrapped in fascination. And maybe that's what connects us across centuries. The realization that the planet is bigger than we think, and far less stable than we'd like. When you read the records from that time, the ship's logs, the weather reports, the diaries, there's a common phrase that appears again and again. The air is strange. It's such a simple observation, but behind it sits the weight of everything that followed. The air was strange. The light was strange. And from that strangeness came hunger, art, migration, madness. Tambora's ash didn't just darken the world. It united it, briefly, under the same gray sky. The farmer in France, the sailor in the Pacific, the poet in Geneva, the priest in Bengal. all lived in the same diminished light. You could almost say Tambora gave the 19th century its mood, that blend of melancholy and awe that filled its paintings and poems. The sense that progress was fragile, that nature's patience was short. And if you listen carefully, you can still hear it, the echo of that explosion, carried in the thin layer of ash that still lies buried deep in Arctic ice. Every core sample pulled from Greenland or Antarctica holds a faint memory of that year. Scientists can measure it, trace it, and know exactly when the sun dimmed. But they can't measure what it felt like. The fear, the confusion, the long, gray months when people thought daylight might never come back. That's the part history doesn't quantify. The world doesn't end all at once. Sometimes it just loses its light. And when that happens, humanity does what it always does. It adapts, it dreams, it remembers. Next, we'll move closer to the human side of the eruption's aftermath. The stories of those who lived in the shadow of Tambora itself, and how the island became both a tomb and a beginning. Long before the sky dimmed over Europe, before snow fell in June or poets dreamed of monsters, a smaller world had already been erased. The island of Sumbawa, home to Mount Tambora, was one of many quiet, volcanic lands strung across the Indonesian archipelago. Before the eruption, it was alive with forests and rivers, rice paddies and small villages. The people spoke several languages: Tamboran, Sanggar, Dampu, tongues that now exist only as faint echoes in colonial records. They lived close to the mountain because volcanoes, for all their danger, also made the soil rich. Then, in April 1815, the mountain exhaled. At first, it was a rumor of smoke, a distant tremor, something people pointed to and then forgot. But on April 5th, a massive explosion shook the island. Ash rained from the sky for days. Then came the second eruption, the one that split history open. Witnesses on neighboring islands said the sound was like heavy artillery. Sailors 2,000 kilometers away reported hearing it. The sky darkened, and ash fell so thick that people couldn't see their own hands. A British officer stationed on Java wrote, "The darkness was so complete that we could not distinguish the night from day. For 3 days the world near Tambora was night. The mountain's summit collapsed into itself, sending avalanches of molten rock and gas racing down its sides at hundreds of kilometers per hour. They call these pyroclastic flows, a phrase that sounds clinical until you understand what it means. It means fire that moves faster than the wind. It means people caught mid-step, mid-prayer, mid-breath, and turned to ash. Within 24 hours, everything within 25 miles of Tambora was gone. The villages of Tambora, Peket, and Sanggar, once home to tens of thousands, were buried beneath 100 feet of ash. Survivors described the landscape afterward as a plain of bones. Ships anchored off the coast reported waves taller than palm trees crashing into the shore. These were tsunamis, walls of water set off by the collapsing mountain. They swept away entire fishing settlements along Sumbawa and neighboring islands. Bodies washed ashore for days. The air turned so thick with ash that people could not breathe. Cattle suffocated where they stood. Birds fell from the sky. The sea was choked with pumice that floated like islands. One Dutch colonial officer tried to reach the island weeks later. When his ship approached, he wrote that the shoreline looked as if it had been melted. The smell of sulfur hung in the air like rot. The jungle was gone, replaced by gray dunes. He found no one alive in the villages nearest the mountain. Only scorched trees, their trunks still steaming. For years, the island remained uninhabitable. Rain mixed with ash to form cement. Streams turned to acid. Crops would not grow. The few survivors, mostly those who lived on the far edges of the island, were forced to flee. Some made it to neighboring Lombok or Bali. Others died along the way. The old Tamboran language vanished with them. Entire traditions, songs, and stories simply stopped existing. What we know of that culture comes from a handful of notes written by European traders before the eruption. Small, fragile records of a people erased in one night. In that sense, Tambora didn't just destroy a mountain. It silenced a civilization. Even those who lived far away felt the aftermath. On the island of Lombok, days turned to twilight. Ash fell so heavily that roofs collapsed under its weight. People wrapped their faces in cloth, not knowing why the air burned their lungs. The sun was a pale circle behind curtains of dust. Weeks later, rain came, acidic and black. It stained skin, stripped leaves from trees, and filled wells with sludge. Survivors collected it anyway, drinking poison because there was nothing else. By June, famine had begun. Crops were buried, animals gone. The few plants that managed to sprout were covered in gray film that smelled of sulfur. Fishermen found that the sea had changed too. The water tasted bitter, and the fish had disappeared. Colonial authorities tried to help, but they were paralyzed by distance and ignorance. Java, hundreds of kilometers away, was blanketed in ash. Roads were impassable. Letters took months to travel. When officials finally reached Sumbawa, they found only ghosts. One British officer named Lieutenant Phillips led a small expedition in late 1815. His report reads like something between an obituary and a nightmare. He wrote, "The trees are all stripped of leaves. The ground is covered with ashes. The streams are dry, and every trace of habitation is destroyed. Of the inhabitants of the kingdom of Tambora, none remain." He found survivors only in Dampu, further south, where a few hundred people had escaped the suffocating ash by hiding in boats. Their faces were blistered, their voices hoarse. They spoke of darkness that lasted for days, of screams drowned out by thunder, of a sky that rained fire. By the end of that year, it was estimated that at least 10,000 people had died on Sumbawa itself, and another 80,000 across the region from famine and disease. The numbers are uncertain because no one kept proper records. How could they? The people who could write were dead. The rest of the world barely noticed. Europe was rebuilding after Napoleon's wars. The Americas were expanding westward. The colonies in Asia were simply expected to endure their disasters quietly. Tambora's eruption was reported as a curiosity, not a tragedy. It would take nearly a century for scientists to understand its true scale. And yet, in the local folklore that survived on neighboring islands, Tambora became more than a volcano. It became a god, a reminder that the earth itself breathes, sleeps, and sometimes dreams in fire. Elders told stories of the mountain's anger, of the spirits of the buried calling out during storms. On some nights, when lightning flashed inside the caldera, they said the dead were lighting their torches again. It's easy for us now, sitting under electric lights, to think of volcanoes as geological events, pressure, magma, chemistry. But to the people who lived there, it was personal. The mountain had been alive. They had trusted it. And in a single night, it had betrayed them. That betrayal left its mark in ways science couldn't measure. The ash that settled into the soil became part of the island's future generations. Even now, when farmers dig deep enough, they find the bones of the old villages. Bits of pottery, melted tools, charred rice grains turned to glass. Sumbawa, as it was, vanished. But in vanishing, it gave the world something immense. A reminder that destruction in one place can ripple across oceans, shaping the fate of people who will never even know the name of the mountain that changed their sky. A single eruption on a forgotten island had set off a chain reaction that would dim the sun, freeze crops, inspire art, and alter history. And yet, at its core, it was still a human story. Thousands of voices lost beneath layers of silence and ash. If you stand at Tambora's crater today, it's eerily quiet. The air smells faintly of sulfur. The jungle has returned, green and patient. But beneath that calm, the ground is still hot. The crater yawns a mile deep, filled with mist. Birds circle above, and sometimes, when the wind is right, you can hear a faint whisper rising from below. It's just the wind, of course, but it sounds like breathing. After the mountain fell silent, the sky began to move. From the ruins of Sumbawa, a thin, invisible cloud began drifting westward, slow, steady, and almost unnoticeable. It didn't look like much. From the ground, it was just a haze, a strange dulling of the sunlight, a slight cooling of the wind. But higher up, far beyond sight, it was something else entirely. Billions of fine particles, so light they could stay aloft for years. The ash of Tambora had become a traveler. Riding the equatorial winds, it spread across the Indian Ocean, scattering sunlight as it went. Ships crossing those waters wrote about it long before scientists understood it. The captains didn't use words like aerosols or sulfuric acid. They called it a dusty veil, a strange fog that neither moved nor lifted. By May of 1815, sailors near India noticed sunsets that burned crimson for hours. The stars were dimmer. The moon looked sickly yellow-green at its edges. A British naval officer recorded that even the compass needles behaved oddly, twitching as if lost. When his ship reached the coast of Africa, the same haze was waiting. From there, it crossed the continent and moved into the Atlantic, following the trade winds like a ghost ship. Within months, it had encircled the globe. The sun still shone, but weaker. The temperature dropped, and no one connected it to the volcano. How could they? Indonesia might as well have been another planet. Communication across oceans took months. By the time Europe began to freeze, the eruption was already a year in the past, reduced to a few reports in colonial newspapers. What people did notice were the skies. Artists began to paint them. Journalists began to describe them. Farmers began to fear them. In Calcutta, the dawns turned blood orange. In Cairo, the horizon glowed like copper. In Paris, travelers wrote that the sunsets looked like heaven burning. The light was unlike anything anyone had seen. Muted yet violent, a world permanently trapped in twilight. It was beautiful and it was wrong. The haze wrapped around the world, scattering light and bending shadows. Days felt shorter. The air carried a strange sharpness, like metal. People complained that their eyes hurt, that their moods shifted without reason. Even the animals seemed restless. In North America, farmers noticed it too. That summer, the evenings stretched long and eerie. The sun sank behind a veil of color, pink, then purple, then gray. Like God had painted the sky with smoke, one farmer wrote. He didn't know that the paint had come from a mountain half a world away. When you look at modern satellite images of volcanic eruptions, you see perfect spirals of ash curling across the oceans. Tambora's cloud was like that, only slower, denser, more persistent. It blocked sunlight by just a few percent. But that was enough. A few percent less sunlight meant a few degrees colder. A few degrees colder meant frost in June, snow in July, famine by winter. That's how the chain reaction began. And while the scientists of the 19th century couldn't see it, they felt it. The French astronomer François Arago observed that the atmosphere seemed tinged with a dull and permanent cloud. In Germany, Johann Humboldt wrote that the stars looked blurred, as though seen through dirty glass. They were witnessing climate science before climate science existed. But ordinary people didn't care about theories. They cared about survival. As the haze thickened, harvests failed. The ash travelers, as some writers later called them, had turned the sky into a mirror, reflecting life's warmth away. There's something almost cruel about it. A disaster born in fire, ending in ice. In the Caribbean, sailors noticed the wind patterns changing. Storms moved in unpredictable directions. The monsoons that once defined Asia's rhythm were broken. For 2 years, the seasons went mad. And in those years, the ash continued its invisible journey. It drifted north toward Europe, falling slowly, imperceptibly. You can still find its signature today, trapped in Arctic ice cores. A thin gray band that marks the moment the world dimmed. Scientists studying those layers describe them like chapters in a book. Each centimeter of ice holds a season. The layer from 1816 looks bruised, discolored, and full of sulfur. That sulfur is the fingerprint of Tambora. That's how we know the ash reached everywhere. By the time it reached Europe, the haze had blended into weather itself. People assumed the dull skies were part of a natural cycle. The word volcano didn't even enter the conversation until decades later. But the haze wasn't just physical. It seeped into the human imagination. Painters like Turner turned it into gold and fire. Poets turned it into metaphor. The world's palette changed, darker, moodier, more introspective. It's no coincidence that Romanticism, that brooding fascination with beauty and doom, flourished in the aftermath of the eruption. If you look at the art of that decade, you can almost feel the ash in the air. The colors are too vivid, the light too strange. It's as if the planet's trauma had become its new aesthetic. Meanwhile, in the oceans, sailors still wrote about the haze. Some believed it was the work of distant fires, entire continents burning beyond the horizon. Others thought it was sea mist, eternal and unbroken. A few suspected something supernatural. One Dutch captain wrote in his log, "The world seems wrapped in smoke, and yet nothing burns." He wasn't wrong. The world was wrapped in smoke. Only the fire had burned a year earlier and 1,000 leagues away. It's hard not to see a metaphor there. How the consequences of one explosion can travel silently, unnoticed, until they arrive at your doorstep in the form of bad weather. We like to think we understand cause and effect, but history often hides the connection. In 1816, a farmer in England didn't know he was reaping the ashes of an island he'd never heard of. A painter in France didn't know the colors on his canvas came from sulfur floating above his head. A starving family in Ireland didn't know the frost that killed their potatoes had begun as fire on the rim of the Pacific. That's what makes Tambora so haunting. It wasn't just a local tragedy. It was global cause and invisible effect. And in that invisibility lies a lesson that's still uncomfortable today. The planet remembers. The sky keeps secrets. Every action, every spark, every plume travels further than we think. By the winter of 1816, the ash travelers had completed their circuit. The veil around the world was almost complete. Sunlight struggled through it, weak and scattered. And humanity began its slow spiral into confusion, hunger, and fear. But there were still those who found beauty in it. Sailors watched the sunsets from their decks, describing them as paintings too vivid for comfort. Poets saw omens. Scientists saw mystery. And for a brief moment, the entire planet, every empire, every faith, every soul, looked up at the same sky and wondered if the world was ending. It wasn't, of course. The world rarely ends. It just changes color. The ash would take years to fall, and decades to fade from memory. But before that happened, it would paint the sky blood red, turn the seasons upside down, and push humanity into its strangest year. A year without summer. The year when the sun disappeared. There are disasters that roar and then fade, and there are others that simply never leave. By the summer of 1816, the world had stopped roaring. The ash had drifted high enough to quiet the skies. There were no more explosions, no sound at all, just a stillness that felt wrong. And then came the snow. It began in places that were supposed to be warm. In late May, frost hit northern France. The vines of Burgundy turned black overnight. Farmers there had seen hard winters before, but none that came so late. Then, in Switzerland, sleet began to fall over the mountain pastures where cattle should have been grazing. It melted by noon, only to return by evening. By June, the weather turned from strange to impossible. In Ireland, entire flocks of sheep froze in their fields. In Germany, thunderclouds hovered for weeks, releasing torrents of icy rain that washed away soil. Lightning struck in every direction, but the thunder seemed muffled, echoing through the haze that hung in the sky. And in America, the snow fell. On June 6th, residents of Vermont woke to white rooftops. The wind came from the north, sharp enough to strip bark from trees. Birds dropped mid-flight. Cows collapsed and couldn't stand. The newspapers called it the Great Cold. In New England, the temperature fell below freezing for nearly a week. Farmers stood in their fields and watched their corn turn gray. One man in Massachusetts wrote, "I have lived 60 years, and I have never seen the like." The snow drifted through New York and into Quebec, where it reached 2 feet deep in some towns. People dug through it in silence, muttering that perhaps the seasons had changed for good. When it finally stopped, the frost returned. It was as if the sun had been stolen and replaced with something counterfeit. Daylight was thin, colorless, cold to the touch. There was no true summer anywhere north of the equator. Across Europe, the same pattern repeated. Rain, frost, thunder, hail, then nothing but gray. In July, snow fell again in Switzerland. Ice covered the lakes. Children skated on what should have been summer water. In Italy, hailstones the size of fists destroyed vineyards and olive trees. In Scotland, crops rotted where they stood. In England, the great fields of barley failed twice in a row. Everywhere, people began to speak of omens. In France, the church bells tolled for the harvest that never came. Priests warned that the world was entering its final days. In Ireland, people said the fairies were punishing humankind for cutting down too many trees. And in Germany, pamphlets appeared describing the darkening of the heavens as divine wrath. The word apocalypse found its way into everyday speech, not as metaphor but as weather report. Hunger began to bite before autumn even arrived. Markets stood empty. Bread prices soared. A loaf that had cost a few sous now cost an entire week's pay. Families traded furniture for flour. Bakers were attacked in the streets, their ovens ransacked by mobs. In some cities, soldiers stood guard outside granaries. They were ordered to shoot looters on sight. Most didn't. They were hungry too. Letters from that year are filled with a kind of dull astonishment. No one quite believed it could continue. Surely the sun must return. One Parisian merchant wrote in July, "Surely the sky cannot forget itself forever." But the sky had, and it would not forgive itself until winter. The oddest thing was how quiet everything felt. When the weather doesn't behave, the natural rhythm of life collapses. No insects, no birdsong, no distant murmur of rivers because even the rivers had frozen over in July. The silence unnerved people more than the cold did. In some towns, the bells stopped ringing altogether. Not out of superstition, but because there were no funerals left to hold. Everyone had already gone. And then came the strange colors. The sunsets that year were unlike anything the world had seen. The haze from Tambora scattered light into impossible shades. Copper, violet, blood red. The poet Thomas Campbell wrote that the sky looked as though it had been drenched in wine. Painters tried to capture it. J.M.W. Turner, who had grown up in London's smoky air, suddenly found himself staring at sunsets so vivid they looked unreal. His paintings from that period glow with the afterlight of Tambora. Fiery horizons, black clouds, sun reduced to a smoldering ember. Beauty and horror side by side. Even as the world suffered, people couldn't look away from the sky. Perhaps that's a kind of coping mechanism. When the earth betrays you, you start looking upward for meaning. In the countryside, People built makeshift shrines, lighting candles under the dull sky. Some prayed for the sun's return. Others demanded answers. A few went mad. There are records of men standing in the fields and shouting at the sky for hours, demanding it explain itself. In Switzerland, entire families packed their belongings and began walking south, hoping to find warmth in Italy. Many never made it. They collapsed from hunger or cold on the mountain passes. The ones who did survive found that Italy wasn't any better. The frost had killed the crops there too. And still, the rain kept falling. By August, the Rhine had flooded. Towns along its banks disappeared under water. Mudslides swept through valleys. The combination of cold and dampness brought disease, dysentery, cholera, fever. It's difficult, reading the old records, to find a single day that wasn't marked by loss. And yet, in all that misery, life clung on in small, strange ways. People began eating things they'd never eaten before. Boiled nettles, moss, dogs, cats, rats. In some regions, people made bread from clay mixed with water. It filled the stomach but broke the teeth. Children scavenged for snails. Farmers dug up half-rotten potatoes and thanked God for them. The rich fled to the cities, thinking they'd be safer. They weren't. The markets ran dry, the fires went out, and disease followed them too. In Vienna, the composer Franz Schubert lived through that same gray summer, writing songs full of longing and melancholy. He called one of them Winterreise, the winter journey. It's tempting to think he was writing about a season, but maybe he was writing about a world that had lost its way. By autumn, the phrase "the year without a summer" had begun to appear in diaries. It wasn't yet history. It was a joke told by desperate people, a way to laugh at the absurdity of snow in August. But no one laughed for long. The following winter came early and hard. Temperatures dropped lower than anyone could remember. The crops that had barely sprouted were wiped out. Europe entered 1817 not just hungry, but haunted. In that endless cold, communities changed forever. The old rhythms of planting and harvest, of prayer and celebration, broke. People moved, fled, scattered. Some never went back. And when, finally, the weather began to ease, when sunlight returned in hesitant flickers, humanity looked at itself and saw something new. It had survived, but at a cost. The world seemed smaller now, the sky more fragile. Even in the calm years that followed, people spoke of that summer in whispers. They said it wasn't just the weather that froze. It was faith itself. And maybe they were right, because once you've seen snow fall in June, you never quite believe in the seasons again. By the start of 1817, the world had become smaller. The map hadn't changed, but the distance between hunger and despair had shrunk to nothing. Every road, every village, every market was tied together by the same invisible thread: famine. People would remember 1817 as Das Hungerjahr, the hunger year. It wasn't just a name. It was a diagnosis, a confession. The signs had been there since the first frost of 1816, but by now, they were impossible to ignore. The granaries were empty. The fields were bare. The seed stock had been eaten during the long gray months. What little grain remained was guarded by soldiers or hoarded by the rich. And so Europe began to starve. In France, bread riots broke out. Crowds stormed bakeries shouting, "Pain! Pain!" The same word for both bread and suffering. The distinction had vanished. Women fought soldiers in the streets, clawing for crumbs. Bakeries that couldn't keep up simply closed, their windows smashed by hungry hands. In Germany, peasants gathered outside the homes of merchants, chanting through the night. In some towns, the local authorities banned the ringing of church bells because it caused panic. Bells meant funerals, and funerals were constant. In Switzerland, people ate moss scraped from rocks. Travelers wrote of seeing mothers carrying dead children in their arms, wandering from town to town asking for milk that didn't exist. Cattle had been slaughtered months earlier. Horses were gone, eaten or sold. The lucky ones kept goats. The unlucky ones ate them. The historian John Post, writing long afterward, described how the famine spread like frost over glass, slowly, evenly, leaving nothing untouched. The cold wasn't what killed people. It was the exhaustion, the waiting, the endless days of gray. When the body starves, it turns in on itself. It begins to consume its own muscle, its own organs, until it collapses. But before that happens, something else gives way, the mind. Reports from Germany and Austria describe people hallucinating food. Farmers standing in empty fields, plowing the frozen earth as if to remind themselves what soil once felt like. In some villages, people began to eat strange things. Grass, straw, cats, dogs, even boiled leather. One woman in Württemberg was caught digging up graves, searching for something soft. You can read those records now, safely distanced by centuries, but if you stop to imagine the sound of it, the creak of hunger, it's unbearable. Governments responded as governments always do, with bureaucracy. In Bavaria, officials distributed small rations of barley. In France, they passed price controls. In Britain, politicians debated whether to open the national grain reserves. The arguments lasted longer than the food did. In Ireland, the potato crop had failed again, not from blight but from frost. Families starved quietly, their suffering unnoticed by London. The same cycle would repeat a generation later, on an even greater scale. But 1817 was the rehearsal. In the cities, starvation looked different. It was less dramatic, more polite. People fainted in the streets. Beggars multiplied. The wealthy held charity balls and congratulated themselves for their compassion, while outside, the poor froze against the stone walls of their mansions. One English observer wrote that London had acquired the look of a city under siege. But even in that despair, there were flickers of human stubbornness. In Geneva, a young man named Jean Prévost organized what we might now call a soup kitchen. He used church donations to buy whatever grain he could find, then served thin porridge to the hungry. He wrote, "I cannot make the sun return, but I can keep one more child from dying before it does." In Germany, a Lutheran pastor named Johann Pestalozzi turned his church into a shelter. He called it the House of Waiting. Every evening, people came to sit near the fire, not to eat, but simply to be warm for a few hours. Across the Atlantic, New England was facing its own crisis. The June snow had destroyed the corn crop, and by autumn, livestock were dying. Farmers couldn't afford to feed their animals. They slaughtered them early, salted the meat, and prayed it would last. It rarely did. Whole families packed wagons and headed west, chasing the faint promise of better soil. The roads filled with migrants, sun chasers, as they were called. They left behind shuttered houses and frostbitten orchards. Historians estimate that nearly 15,000 people left Vermont alone in that single year, spreading into what would become Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. It was one of the first great waves of westward migration, born not of ambition but of survival. Even the weather seemed to follow them. Letters from those travelers describe a sky that would not clear, rain that fell for weeks, frost that came too early. One man wrote home, "The sun is here, but it gives no heat. It is a dead thing." In the Caribbean and South America, the story was inverted. There, Tambara's ash had disrupted rainfall so badly that drought spread. Rivers shrank. Crops withered. Hunger took a different shape, dry, cracked, and silent. No one escaped it. By late 1817, Europe's population had fallen by hundreds of thousands. Entire generations of children were lost, not to disease or war, but to emptiness. Even those who survived were changed. Doctors later noted that children born during the famine years were smaller, weaker, more prone to illness. The effects of hunger were hereditary. The term for it didn't exist yet, but the world had just experienced one of the first global climate crises. It wasn't caused by machines or industry, it was caused by the Earth itself. And the lesson it taught was simple. Civilization depends on weather. The memory of that year burned itself into European consciousness. Painters filled canvases with desolate fields and gray skies. Writers filled pages with apocalyptic imagery. Even architecture changed. Churches built after the famine were smaller, more somber, less sure of divine generosity. The famine also exposed something that people had always suspected but rarely said aloud: that nature doesn't care. When the sun disappeared, prayers didn't bring it back. The gods stayed quiet. The world went on. For centuries afterward, old people would tell their grandchildren about that time. They'd point to the mountains or the rivers and say, "I remember when the snow came in summer." It became legend, the kind of story told at firesides on cold nights, a warning dressed as memory. But it wasn't all despair. From the hunger came innovation. Nicholas Appert's method of sealing food in jars began spreading across Europe. The first modern relief organizations were born. Governments began keeping weather records, the seed of what would one day become meteorology. It's a strange truth. Disaster teaches. Pain is a kind of progress. Still, for those who lived it, progress was the last thing on their minds. They wanted bread. They wanted light. They wanted a world that made sense again. And by the end of 1817, the first faint signs of that world's return began to appear. The frost retreated. The rain eased. The sky, still pale, still wounded, began to remember how to be blue. But the relief was cautious, uncertain. The hunger had done more than kill bodies. It had carved a hollow into the human spirit. And when people looked up at that fragile sunlight, they saw not warmth but warning. Because once you've lived through a year when the sky forgets you, you never quite trust it again. When the world began to thaw, no one celebrated. You'd think that after 2 years of darkness and cold, the first touch of sunlight would bring joy, maybe relief. But it didn't. People didn't trust it. The light looked unfamiliar, thin, sharp, uncertain. Felt like the sun had come back as a stranger. By the spring of 1818, the skies over Europe had finally started to clear. The dull gray that had hung like smoke for years began to fade. The sunsets, once crimson and bruised, softened to gold. For the first time in what felt like forever, people could feel warmth on their faces. But after all they'd endured, no one believed it would last. Farmers planted cautiously. They waited longer, watching the sky for signs of betrayal. Some refused to plant at all, convinced the frost would return. They'd learned to measure hope in small doses. The first harvest that year was meager, but it was enough to remind people what green looked like. Villages that had been silent for years began to stir. Children went outside again. Bells rang, not for funerals this time, but for survival. And yet, the joy was quiet. Grief still hung in the air. For many, the famine had taken everything. Families, homes, faith. The survivors walked like ghosts through a world that had barely remembered them. Churches were half empty. Cemeteries were full. And the sky, though blue again, still felt fragile, like glass that might crack under too much sunlight. The newspapers called it a return to balance. But balance is never that simple. The planet doesn't reset itself overnight. The aftereffects of Tambara's eruption lingered for years. Even as the temperatures rose, the climate stayed unpredictable. Storms came without warning. Rain fell where it never had before. But at least there was color again. Painters were the first to notice. Turner, in England, filled his canvases with soft light, sun filtering through mist, as if remembering how to shine. Friedrich, in Germany, painted dawn breaking over ruined landscapes. The light in his paintings wasn't triumphant. It was cautious, reverent. You could almost sense that the artists of that time didn't take daylight for granted anymore. Every sunrise was a miracle, every shadow a reminder. Writers felt it too. Byron, long since back in London, called it the awakening of a patient from fever. Mary Shelley, now known for Frankenstein, kept writing about the fragility of creation, how easily the world could turn against its maker. Even science began to stir from its own darkness. The strange weather had sparked curiosity that no famine could kill. Scholars across Europe started to compare notes, seeking patterns in temperature and rainfall. They built crude thermometers, kept journals, and began sketching what would later become the first meteorological charts. They didn't yet understand that the cause had been a volcano halfway around the world. But the questions were there. Why had the sun vanished? Could it happen again? It was the beginning of a new relationship between humanity and nature, no longer master and servant, but uneasy equals. In the years that followed, a few explorers and natural philosophers started connecting the dots. Reports from the East Indies began filtering back to Europe. They spoke of a great mountain that had exploded, of darkness at noon, of entire islands lost. Most Europeans dismissed it as rumor, but a handful of scientists took it seriously. One of them, Sir Stamford Raffles, the British governor of Java at the time, wrote a detailed account of the eruption. His report included eyewitness testimonies, measurements of ash depth, and descriptions of the sound that had traveled across the ocean. When it reached London in 1821, it caused a quiet sensation. For the first time, people had evidence that a single natural event could change the world. Raffles wrote, "The eruption of Mount Tambora has darkened the atmosphere beyond the limits of sight or sound. The heavens themselves have been obscured." He didn't realize how right he was. Slowly, the idea began to take shape that nature operated on scales far beyond human comprehension. It wasn't divine punishment, it was physics. The earth, they realized, could wound itself. That realization changed everything. It reshaped how people saw weather, how they saw time, even how they saw God. Faith began to share space with science. And for the first time, humanity began to understand that the sky was not eternal, it could be broken. But for ordinary people, the return of sunlight meant simpler things. Food, warmth, and the chance to live without fear of waking to snow in June. In the fields of England, the wheat grew tall again. In France, the vines returned. In Switzerland, the ice on Lake Geneva finally melted. People stood by the shore and watched the water move freely for the first time in years. It must have felt like forgiveness. Of course, the scars remained. You could see them in the faces of the survivors, in the empty spaces on village registers. The famine had thinned entire generations. Many of those who lived through it never fully recovered. They aged quickly. They spoke quietly. They kept food stored in corners, even when the cupboards were full. They didn't call it trauma then, but that's what it was, the world's first global trauma. And though the earth had begun to heal, the memory of its silence lingered. Even decades later, when new volcanoes erupted, like Krakatoa in 1883, people still remembered the year the sun disappeared. They spoke of it with reverence and fear, as though it had been a visitation rather than a disaster. There's a kind of wisdom that comes from that kind of fear. The recognition that survival is never guaranteed, that civilization is a thin layer over chaos. That wisdom seeped into culture. It influenced literature, philosophy, art, everything that followed. The Romantic era, with all its fascination with nature's power, was born from those dark skies. It was as if the world had decided to fall in love with the thing that almost destroyed it. Even now, scientists studying climate change look back at 1816 for clues. The same patterns of cooling, the same strange sunsets, appear in the data. Tambora remains a benchmark for what happens when the planet sneezes and humanity catches a fever. But in 1818, all anyone cared about was light. One diary entry from that year reads simply, "The sun has come back, but it does not feel the same. I think it is older now. Or perhaps I am." There's something quietly profound about that line. It captures the mood of an entire age, relief laced with melancholy, hope tempered by memory. Because the truth was, the sun hadn't changed. Humanity had. They had lived through a world where warmth could vanish overnight, where color could drain from the sky, where time itself seemed to freeze. They had looked into the void between nature and survival and somehow stepped back from it. And as the light returned, they didn't just rebuild their farms and cities. They rebuilt their understanding of what it meant to live on this fragile, unpredictable planet. The sun had disappeared once, could disappear again. But for now, it was enough to feel it on their faces, to see it glint on the river, to watch the shadows return to their proper places. And if they prayed that night, they didn't pray for mercy. They prayed for memory. The world had thawed, but it hadn't forgotten. The strange skies of 1816 lingered in memory like an old bruise. The air felt lighter now, the light clearer, but beneath that brightness lay a quiet obsession. What had happened to the sun? It's easy, with hindsight, to see what they couldn't. We have satellites, data models, laboratories. They had notebooks, quills, and long, sleepless nights of wondering whether God was angry or the heavens were simply broken. The first to look for answers were not scientists in the modern sense, but natural philosophers. Curious men scattered across Europe, who made careful observations because it was the only power they had. In England, a clergyman named William Scoresby began keeping meticulous weather journals. He noted how the skies still seemed peculiar years after the Great Chill. He measured the dimness of sunlight using candles as comparison, marking how even at noon, the world felt as if it were under tinted glass. In France, François Arago, an astronomer with a mind like a scalpel, started measuring light refraction through the atmosphere. He noticed a haze, consistent but faint, that scattered sunlight more than usual. His calculations hinted that the sky itself had changed composition. But how, he couldn't say. Elsewhere, others were asking similar questions. A few of them had heard stories from the East Indies, of a colossal eruption on a small island, of darkness at noon, of ships sailing through floating ash. The details were vague, filtered through months of travel and mistranslation. But they fit too neatly to ignore. And so began the slow realization that what had dimmed the world might not have been divine punishment or solar decay, but something far more earthly. In 1820, a paper reached the Royal Society in London. It came from Sir Stamford Raffles, the British governor of Java, who had witnessed the aftermath firsthand. His report was methodical and chilling. Entire villages buried, trees uprooted, bodies fused with ash. He described how, even hundreds of miles away, the sound of the eruption had been deafening. He wrote of ships lost in darkness, of waves that devoured coastlines. And he mentioned something peculiar. The air afterward had been strangely cool and smoky, as though the very sky had caught fire and gone out. It was one of the first clues connecting Tambora to the year without a summer. But science in the early 19th century moved slowly. Ideas needed to travel by ship, letter, and word of mouth. It would take decades before anyone fully grasped the scope of what had happened. Meanwhile, the obsession with the vanished sun had taken on a cultural life of its own. Poets wrote about the dying of the light. Painters turned their canvases toward the horizon, chasing the memory of those blood-red skies. Even theology shifted ever so slightly. Some preachers began speaking of God's creation as fragile rather than perfect, something that could break and did. That subtle shift from divine certainty to natural fragility was the beginning of environmental thought. But to the few scientists working in the shadows of that new world, the puzzle remained maddening. How could a single mountain cause the sun to disappear? In the 1830s, a young German geologist named Alexander von Humboldt, already famous for traveling the world cataloging everything from plants to pressure systems, began collecting reports of volcanic eruptions. He suspected they played a larger role in climate than anyone realized. He noted the same peculiar sunsets after other great eruptions, Etna, Vesuvius, and later Krakatoa. To him, the Earth was one organism and volcanoes were its lungs. When it exhaled, the planet changed. That was the poetic version. The scientific version came later. By the mid-19th century, chemistry had finally caught up. Scientists began studying the composition of volcanic gases, sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide, ash, and fine particulates. They realized that sulfuric aerosols could reflect sunlight, cooling the surface of the Earth. It was a revelation, and it fit perfectly with the strange chill of 1816. One of the first to articulate this was Benjamin Franklin, who, years earlier, had speculated that a massive Icelandic eruption in 1783 had caused unusual weather across Europe. People had laughed at the time, but Franklin, ever ahead of his century, had been right. Now the pieces began to fall into place. The year without a summer had been a planetary chain reaction. Fire turned to frost. And as those theories gained traction, something even more profound began to emerge. The idea that humans were not the only architects of history. Up until that point, most historians and philosophers saw the course of civilization as a story of kings, wars, inventions. But Tambora, without intention or malice, had rewritten human destiny. It had killed more people than most wars. It had reshaped migration, agriculture, and art. It had, in a way, created the modern world. That realization made the 19th century uneasy. Progress had become a religion, steam engines, factories, empire, railways. But beneath all that forward motion lay the memory of how fragile it all was. A single breath from the earth could stop it cold. It's perhaps no coincidence that this was also the age of obsession with control, scientific, industrial, even moral. Humanity had seen what happened when nature ran the show. It wanted the reins back, and yet the fascination never left. Scholars started to look backward, combing through old chronicles for signs of other years when the sun had dimmed. They found them. 536 AD, when dust veiled the sky for over a year, bringing famine and plague to the Byzantine Empire. 1257, when another massive eruption darkened medieval Europe. Each discovery added weight to the same uncomfortable truth. History had always been shaped as much by ash as by ambition. By the 1880s, with the eruption of Krakatoa, the scientific world finally confirmed what the survivors of 1816 had only guessed. Krakatoa's explosion produced the same fiery sunsets, the same haze, the same strange drop in temperature. Photographs and weather readings made it undeniable. Volcanoes could change climate. The newspapers that year called it the new Tambora. But for those who had lived through the original, no explanation could undo what had been felt. Even as the science became clear, the emotional memory stayed mystical. People still whispered about the year the sun disappeared, as if it had been an act of cosmic punishment. The rational and the poetic shared the same space, a world that now understood its wounds but still felt them ache. And maybe that's what made the 19th century so haunted. It was the first era that knew it could explain its nightmares, and still preferred to keep them. By the time the century turned, climate science had been born. Meteorological societies sprang up across Europe. Barometers, thermometers, and cloud atlases became tools of progress. The sky, once inscrutable, was now measurable. But for all that precision, one truth remained elusive. Knowing the cause didn't erase the fear. Even now, 200 years later, Scientists can model the cooling effect of Tambora down to fractions of a degree. They can trace its ashen ice cores, name every chemical that filled the air. And yet, when you look at the paintings of those years, the scarlet sunsets, the bruised clouds, you feel something science can't measure. The quiet, human awe of having lived through the moment when daylight faltered. The world, for a time, had been a laboratory for loss. And when it finally understood why, it didn't find comfort, only comprehension. The shadows had a source, but that didn't make them less dark. When the clouds finally cleared, the world that emerged wasn't the same one that had gone into shadow. It had been rearranged geographically, politically, even emotionally. What began as a volcanic tantrum on a faraway island had left fingerprints on everything that followed. The echoes of Tambora weren't just in the soil or the air. They were in migration routes, in the shape of cities, in the rhythm of art, and in the quiet anxiety that settled into the bones of a century. Started, as echoes often do, with movement. The famines of 1816 and 1817 had emptied villages across Europe. People packed what they could carry and left. Some went south, toward warmth. Others crossed oceans. Ships leaving ports like Hamburg and Bremen carried desperate families toward the Americas, chasing the idea of a stable sun. Between 1816 and 1820, tens of thousands of Germans, Swiss, and French emigrated to the United States and Canada. They called themselves Sonnenflüchtling, sun refugees. They built new towns with names that remembered the places they'd lost: New Berlin, New Geneva, New Bavaria. In New England, where the snows of June had driven farmers westward, a new geography was born. Settlers spread into the Ohio Valley, Indiana, and Illinois territories that had once been frontier. What historians now call the Great Migration of the early 19th century began as a slow exodus from frost. So in a strange, indirect way, Tambora helped map the future of America. Meanwhile, in Europe, the hunger that had begun in 1816 lingered in memory for decades. Governments, shaken by their helplessness, began to rethink agriculture. Crop rotation, grain reserves, and early experiments with fertilizers all found urgency after the famine. The modern agricultural revolution, in part, was born from fear. Fear of the sky. The echo was cultural too. The Romantic movement, already blooming before Tambora, now flourished in full color. The poets who had written about the sublime, nature's beauty and terror, suddenly had evidence. The mountains really could crush you. The weather really could forget you. Painters like Caspar David Friedrich filled their canvases with fog, ruins, and light that felt exhausted. J.M.W. Turner painted sunsets that looked apocalyptic. Even long after the skies cleared, he kept painting that haze, the residue of something the world had seen and couldn't unsee. Writers, too, kept returning to the theme of fragility. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was the most famous child of the storm, but it wasn't alone. Byron's Darkness, Polidori's The Vampire, and Shelley's later works all echoed the same truth, that creation and destruction were twins. Even science fiction, though it didn't have a name yet, took its first breath there. In a villa surrounded by thunder, Tambora had made people aware, maybe for the first time, that the planet itself could behave like a character. Unpredictable, sentient in its violence, capable of shaping destiny. It was a subtle shift, but it changed how humans wrote about themselves. The universe stopped being a stage. It became an actor. And while artists wrestled with awe, governments wrestled with consequence. In the British Empire, colonial administrators in India noted the strange weather too. The monsoon had failed for 2 consecutive years, causing drought and famine across Bengal and the Deccan. Millions suffered. It was one of the earliest recorded El Niño-like disruptions linked to a volcanic event. Trade routes adjusted. Food shortages drove up global grain prices, reshaping economies from London to Calcutta. The Industrial Revolution, already underway, accelerated not because people wanted progress, but because they were terrified of dependence on the land. Machines, after all, didn't need sunlight. Factories multiplied. Cities swelled. Steam replaced seasons. It was as if humanity decided, after the year without a summer, that it would never again let the weather decide its fate. That decision came with its own consequences, though no one could see them yet. Tambora had triggered the first global climate crisis, and humanity's response was to begin building another industrial, relentless, self-inflicted. The echo deepened, and yet, even in that shift from field to furnace, the memory of what had happened never completely faded. In folk songs, sermons, and family stories, people still whispered about the year the sky turned gray. In Ireland, the famine legends blended the 1816 cold with older tales of cursed harvests. In Germany, the phrase hunger winter became a proverb for any hard time. Every culture that lived through it found its own way to make sense of the silence. The Romantics made art from it. The poor made faith from it. The scientists made data. And in the quiet corners of academia, the first seeds of a new science began to grow: climatology. By mid-century, the idea of global climate had taken root. Scholars started collecting temperature records, studying volcanic activity, and comparing observations from different continents. They began to realize that the planet's systems were interconnected, that weather in one place could be shaped by fire in another. Tambora, long buried under ash and jungle, had become a teacher. Meanwhile, the volcano itself slept. Its crater cooled, filled with mist, then with trees. Villages slowly crept back onto its slopes. Life returned in the way it always does, quietly, cautiously. The earth forgets faster than we do. But sometimes, forgetting is a form of healing. For decades, travelers who visited Sumbawa found the land strangely peaceful. The soil, enriched by ash, was fertile again. Farmers planted rice in the same valleys where their ancestors had died. Children played among stones that had once been villages. And though most didn't know the full story, the locals still told it. How the mountain had burned the world, how the sun had vanished, how the night had lasted a year. To them, Tambora wasn't a villain. It was a reminder that life and death shared the same ground. Back in Europe, the echoes continued to ripple through culture. The fascination with catastrophe became fashionable. Poets wrote of storms and ruins with almost romantic affection. Even architecture reflected the trauma. Cathedrals gave way to somber stone facades, industrial warehouses, and iron bridges. Humanity had fallen in love with permanence because it no longer trusted permanence to exist. And through all this, a curious new feeling emerged, something we now call modern anxiety. It was the awareness that the world could change without warning, and that no one, not king, nor priest, nor scientist, could stop it. That fear, quiet but constant, became the heartbeat of the 19th century. You can see it in everything from the novels of Dickens to the theories of Darwin. The sense that nature was vast and indifferent, that stability was a story we told ourselves to sleep better. Tambora had cracked the illusion of control. And once cracked, it never quite sealed again. Every storm, every drought, every red sunset afterward carried an echo of that year. Every time frost came early or the sun lingered too long, someone somewhere whispered, "Perhaps it's happening again." Even now, scientists who study the volcanoes of the Pacific speak of Tambora in a kind of reverent hush. Its eruption is the baseline, the yardstick of catastrophe. They use its name as a measure: one Tambora, half a Tambora, two-thirds of a Tambora. It has become the language of apocalypse. But if you listen closely, the story it tells isn't one of doom. It's one of adaptation. For every village lost, another rose. For every famine, a new science. For every vanished summer, 1,000 stories written in its memory. And maybe that's the real legacy of 1816. Not the cold, not the hunger, not even the monsters or the art, but the proof that humanity survives by turning disaster into meaning. We may forget the cause, but we never forget the feeling. That's the echo that still lingers, the hum beneath modern life, the faint tremor in every story we tell about how small we really are. When history remembers disaster, it often forgets the people who lived in its shadow. Tambara's eruption had changed the climate of the world, but on the island itself, life went on, or rather, it began again cautiously from beneath the ash. By the time the skies above Europe started to clear, the survivors on Sumbawa were still trying to understand what had happened to their own world. The island's landscape had been rewritten. Valleys were now cliffs. Rivers had vanished under stone. What had once been rice paddies were plains of hardened ash that cracked in the sun like old bone. The eruption had carved a crater 4 miles wide and a mile deep, and for years afterward, the mountain breathed quietly, as if exhausted by its own violence. Those who lived through it carried the memory in their bodies, scars from burns, lungs damaged by smoke, eyes that watered under the slightest glare. They didn't speak of the eruption. They called it API Besar, the Great Fire. For them, it wasn't history. It was a haunting. The colonial records speak of a few thousand survivors scattered along the coast. Most of them were from neighboring communities, Dampu, Baima, Sangar, who had fled the falling ash. They built makeshift huts from driftwood and palm leaves. The sea was their only source of food, but even the sea had changed. Ash had choked the coral reefs. Fish died in swarms and washed ashore, turning the beaches black with scales. When it rained, the water tasted of sulfur. The survivors boiled it anyway because thirst doesn't care about poison. Those who tried to return to their villages found nothing. The sites where Tambara's towns once stood were buried beneath 30 feet of ash and rock. The ground was still hot. People who dug too deep said they could hear faint sounds below, the hiss of steam, the groan of settling stone. So they moved. They traveled south and west, carrying whatever seeds and animals they could find. They spoke of rebuilding, though most didn't know how. The soil was infertile, the forests gone. The old ways, farming rice, raising cattle, no longer worked. So they adapted. They became foragers, fishermen, traders. Some married into families on neighboring islands, Bali, Lombok, Flores, taking their memories with them. Over time, those memories became stories. They told of a mountain that had grown angry, of spirits buried under fire, of a world turned to night. Children were warned never to anger the volcano gods. Offerings were made to the mountain's ghost, even after its peak was gone. In the local dialect, the phrase Tanamati, dead land, entered common speech. It didn't just mean infertile soil. It meant the memory of everything that once lived there. The Dutch colonial government sent expeditions in the following decades to study the island. They measured the crater, cataloged the ash, and described the scene in dry, bureaucratic detail. But between those lines, you can sense their discomfort. They were walking through a cemetery without graves. One expedition leader wrote, "The land is silent, but one feels watched, as though the very stones remember." In a way, they did. The ash preserved fragments of daily life. Clay pots, wooden beams, jewelry, even skeletons, frozen in the moment of the eruption. It would take nearly 2 centuries before archaeologists began to unearth them, finding entire villages buried like a tropical Pompeii. They found traces of homes with tools still on the floor, cooking pots still on fire, beads scattered across thresholds. The ash had captured the instant the world ended. Those remains revealed something else. The people of Tambara had been more advanced than history remembered. Their artifacts showed trade with faraway islands, ceramics from China, coins from Java, textiles woven in complex patterns. They were not isolated villagers. They were part of a network, a living web of culture that vanished overnight. For nearly 200 years, no one spoke their name. The Tambourines disappeared from memory as thoroughly as their villages had disappeared beneath the mountain.